All right. Well, what if someone came to you and told you that they could train you, teach you, to do your job faster and more efficiently? And that person had absolutely no experience or knowledge of exactly what it is you do. You'd think they were probably crazy, right?
Yeah.
Well, that is the experience that Bruce Hamilton writes about in his article, Lean by Doing, which describes his first experience with Shigeo Shingo's single-minute exchange of dies, or SMED. And for those of you who aren't familiar with the term, it refers to a rapid and efficient way of converting a manufacturing process from running the current product to running the next product. And it doesn't have to be a die change, even though that's what the name refers to. It can be any production change. So Shingo was able to help companies, for instance, reduce these changeovers from hours to down to minutes, or sometimes even to seconds. And it's just a way of looking at your process. So with us this morning via Skype is Bruce Hamilton, president of GBMP and director emeritus for the Shingo Institute, home of the Shingo Prize. I think a lot of you are familiar with that. We talked about it a lot on the show. And also, Bruce is also a past recipient of the Shingo Prize in both the business and the academic categories. Hi, Bruce. Thanks for joining us this morning.
Good morning, or afternoon, Dirk. Which side of the continent you're on? And Mike also. Happy to be with you today.
Well, thanks, Bruce. Hey, you know, in your article, you refer to not being able, yourself and your team, not being able to see ways to improve a CNC changeover operation because of, quotes, conceptual blind spots. And I believe a consultant was the one who gave you that term. Can you describe what was happening in your situation at that time and what a conceptual blind spot is?
Yeah, so incidentally, I just used setup, the setup example as an example, because it could apply to just about any changes that you're making in Lean. And in fact, the term conceptual blind spot is one that I took from one of Shigeo Shingo's books. He made this point early along that sometimes we just can't see because we're blinded by our predispositions, and that's what I was talking about. In the case of setup reduction, there was, even though we'd read Shingo's books and we had kind of a basic idea of the techniques, there was a fear on the part of the operators that we were trying to make them move faster. And you've talked to anybody who's operating a machine, rushing to do a setup is a scary thing. They're afraid of a crash or afraid of a safety problem. It just didn't make sense to them. Also, we had a conceptual blind spot that somehow or other there was some optimal level of inventory we could produce, and that was hard to get by, even though practically speaking, we could see that we were never seemed to be set up to make the right stuff. But talking about making smaller quantity just didn't seem to fit. You're making us rush to make smaller quantities. There's going to be, we see nothing but problems. And finally, a final conceptual blind spot would be that any road to Boston is okay as long as you get there. So we had a lot of issues around standardization as it applied to setups. But I'll give you one specific example. After the consultant began to work with us, a challenge that she offered to us. We were looking at the tool holders, which have 4 bolts that have to be bolted onto a turret, and there's 6 of those on this particular CNC machine, each one of them with 4 bolts. And she asked the question, why 4 bolts? And the operators kind of looked at each other and they said, well, because it requires 4 bolts. And she said, well, why does it require 4 bolts? And it kind of came down to because there's 4 holes. So this led to some brainstorming, and one of the operators said, we could replace 2 of those with pins, with guide pins. It would make it easier to get the tool holder back on, and we could just mount it with 2 bolts. So I think there might have been an engineer who said, oh, that'll never work because of vibration, and the manufacturer isn't going to like that. But anyway, we tried it, and it worked. So there's a particular example of 2 bolts taken out, 2 bolts reapplied. We wouldn't be changing tool holders on every single occasion, but this added up to, as I recall, about 20 seconds per tool holder. And that was pretty significant. That was a bit of an epiphany for all of us because we'd never thought about that kind of change. We just figured there's some things that are fixed and we have to live with them, and there's others that we can change. So there's an example of a conceptual blind spot that our consultant from the TSSC helped us through.
Okay. Well, I mean, so you said something there that I think was a little interesting. You mentioned that that the consultant in your article, you mentioned that the consultant knew little about CNC machining. So how could a person with no experience in that process or even CNC machining, tell you how to improve it? I mean, how does that work?
Yeah, so I mean, that was kind of a lesson in itself, and maybe this was something we had kind of figured out that I'd been saying for a long time, that it wasn't so much about the work, it was about the things that get in the way of the work. But she helped us to refocus on the things that get in the way of the work. It's just kind of a natural tendency to watch the work and turn a blind eye to the things that aren't working. If there are really big problems, then you see them, but if there are little delays and hiccups and sleights of hand to get something done, you sort of wish them away. And she helped us to watch for those. This particular person did have an industrial engineering degree. I would guess she was maybe 23 years old. She was the daughter of a Toyota supplier who was coming up to our site to practice. Okay, but what she knew that I didn't know was that all these changes were possible, and she asked endless questions. So it wasn't what she knew. She wanted to draw out of us what we already knew, but we're kind of not watching carefully.
Well, Bruce, you already described a moment, an interesting moment where you kind of got rid of 2 bolts in a process in a tool changeover, and got it down to from 4 to 2. Were there other moments or were there other events maybe where it kind of the dime dropped for you and it all clicked in and you understood really how this process was intended to work?
Well, it was an interesting progression, Mike. This consultant came in. And for 2 days, she stood out at a particular machine. We'd agreed to work on one machine. She stood at a machine with a white pad, paper pad, to record things that the operators felt needed to be done. And for almost all of those 2 days, they ignored her. And she didn't press. She just watched and asked questions. But at the end of those 2 days, there was one item on the sheet, and it essentially said this machine needs an overhaul. And she says the machine isn't true, and it's impossible to set it up properly if it's not overhauled. And she said, "I'll be back in 3 weeks." And I said, "Well, I don't think I can get it done in 3 weeks." And she said, "Well, then I won't be back." So guess what? I got it done in 3 weeks, and it was a struggle because we weren't accustomed to operating that fast. This process is much more of a change for management than for the folks on the floor. They referred to it sometimes as dragging me through a keyhole, and it felt that way on occasion. But anyway, she came back after this was fixed, and the next time she left, there were 8 pages of things the operators felt could be done. And as an example, when one thing was done and there was a discovery, their confidence improved, and they started looking for more and more things. More and more ideas popped because, through this kind of tacit learning, we tried it, it worked, more and more persons began to kick in, and it was pretty exciting, actually.
Hey, Bruce, you have a Lean conference coming up soon, right? The Northeast Lean Conference in October. Can you tell us what that's about and what people can expect to see there?
Yeah, so thank you, and thank you for letting me talk about the conference for a moment. This is our 12th year for the conference, and we get about 600 or 700 folks at the conference, about a third from healthcare, actually, and 2/3 from manufacturing, and then other services as well. And this year's theme is exactly about what I'd written my article about. I absolutely believe that while there's a lot of good literature and videos, GBMP makes videos, but this is not a process that you can learn unless you get your hands dirty, unless you actually get into it and try it. And once you try it, just as in the example I was giving with SMED, once people get into it, all of a sudden, they're learning with their body, not just with their mind, and they're figuring things out. So we dedicated this year's conference to themes that all deal with learning by doing. We have some, great speakers lined up. John Shook will be there, and Steven Spear, and then we get 2 great lean practitioners in Art Byrne, from formerly of Wire Mold, and Dr. Eric Dixon, who's CEO of probably largest hospital in central Massachusetts, and a great lean leader. But we also have a lot of folks who are right off the floor, who are talking about things that they've done and what they've gotten. It's a great opportunity for sharing, and we've committed to having at least 50% of all the presentations with a takeaway or some sort of lean by doing exercise, so that we can, practice, kind of communicate through the conference this idea that the only way you really learn lean is by doing it.
All right, well, Bruce Hamilton, thanks for joining us this morning. And be sure to check out the conference that Bruce was talking about. You can look it up. It's just www.northeastleanconference.org, just as it sounds, northeastleanconference.org.
And there's a link in his article as well.
And there's a link in his article as well that you can click on and go out there and check out that conference. If you're involved in lean, it's probably something that you don't want to miss. So once again, Bruce, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Okay.
Good afternoon.
So long.
See you, Bruce. Thanks. Yeah, and if you know about lean and you listen to some of the names of the speakers that he ran through there,
yeah.
I mean, Art Byrne, John Shook, I mean, these are, and Bruce himself, I mean, these are leaders. These are really, really leaders, people that have been doing this for many decades here in the United States, in many cases learned it directly from Japan, and these are some high-level people.
And actually, an interesting thing, and we've talked about this a lot, interesting thing he mentions, a third of the people are from
healthcare.
Healthcare.
Yeah,
it's such a growing, huge growth in healthcare in these in lean and so forth. Yeah.
Not a surprise. All right, thank you. All right, thanks, Bruce, for joining us. All right, well.